It was a crisp Tuesday morning when Harold Jackson, a 68-year-old black man with a calm demeanor and a quiet air of authority, walked into the opulent downtown branch of Heritage National Bank. Dressed in a simple brown cardigan and neatly pressed slacks, Harold didn't stand out among the bank's usual clientele, many of whom were adorned in tailored suits and designer accessories. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had long learned not to let appearances dictate his worth. The bank's interior was a showcase of affluence, marble floors gleaming under the natural light streaming through oversized windows, rows of mahogany desks attended by sharply dressed bankers, and a discreet hum of activity that spoke of wealth in motion. Harold stepped up to the reception desk where a young woman, Susan Carter, stood reviewing paperwork. "Good morning," Harold began, his voice steady but warm. "I have an appointment to meet with the branch manager." Susan glanced up briefly, her eyes darting over him as if assessing his right to be there. Her expression barely masked her skepticism. Dismissing him as just another walk-in, she said curtly, "Do you have an account with us?" "Yes, I do," Harold replied patiently, "and I believe Mr. Blake is expecting me." Susan frowned slightly, clearly unimpressed. "Do you have proof of your appointment? This branch operates on a tight schedule. Without a confirmation, I'm afraid I can't let you in." Harold raised an eyebrow, his calm exterior unshaken. "I was under the impression that I wouldn't need to provide a confirmation for a pre-scheduled meeting." Just then, Richard Blake, the branch manager, appeared from his office. A middle-aged white man with an air of self-importance, Richard was scanning the room when his eyes landed on Harold. Approaching the scene with practiced authority, he interjected, "Is there a problem here?" Susan immediately deferred to him. "This gentleman claims to have a meeting with you, but I couldn't find his appointment on the system." Richard gave Harold a once-over, his gaze lingering on the older man's modest attire. "I'm sorry, but without proper documentation or identification, I can't allow you to take up our time. Perhaps you're looking for another branch." Harold straightened slightly, his voice steady but firm. "I think you should double-check. I assure you, I am where I'm supposed to be." Richard smirked, interpreting Harold's calm insistence as defiance. "Listen, sir, we have procedures in place for a reason. I suggest you either provide proof or leave. This is a busy branch and we can't afford delays." The tension in the room was palpable. Customers and staff alike turned their attention to the scene unfolding near the reception desk. Harold's calm began to erode slightly under the weight of the disrespect being hurled his way. He inhaled deeply, then responded with measured words, "Perhaps it's you who should be reconsidering your actions. But if you insist—" Richard cut him off with a dismissive wave. "That's enough. Security," he barked, signaling the guard stationed nearby. The security officer approached with hesitant steps, glancing between Harold and Richard as if gauging the situation. "Please escort this man out," Richard ordered, his tone carrying an air of finality. Without protest, Harold stepped back, his gaze sweeping over the room, taking in the faces of those watching. He offered no further resistance as the security guard guided him to the exit, though his steady eyes seemed to hold a silent message. As Harold stepped outside into the brisk air, he pulled out his smartphone. Dialing a number, he spoke in a calm but authoritative tone. "It seems the staff at the Main Street branch need a lesson in customer service. I'll need you there in 15 minutes. Ending the call, Harold leaned back against his car, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Inside the bank, Richard and Susan were still congratulating themselves on maintaining their professional standards, completely unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. Inside the bank, Richard and Susan returned to their routine, sharing a quiet chuckle about the encounter. "Some people just don't get it," Richard remarked, shaking his head as he adjusted his cufflinks. "You can't just walk in here and expect special treatment without earning it." Susan nodded, her voice tinged with satisfaction. "It's always the ones who don't belong who think they can bend the rules." Unbeknownst to them, the atmosphere in the branch began to shift. Customers whispered among themselves, glancing towards the reception area where the scene had just played out. Some were clearly uncomfortable, their faces reflecting disapproval, while others seemed entertained by the power play. Meanwhile, outside, Harold remained composed as he waited in his car. Shortly after his call, a convoy of black luxury sedans pulled up. Out stepped three sharply dressed individuals, their demeanor exuding authority and purpose. They were senior executives from the bank's corporate headquarters, summoned by Harold himself. Back inside, the quiet hum of activity in the branch was interrupted by the sound of the glass doors swinging open. The executives entered, their presence commanding immediate attention. Their polished shoes clicked against the marble floor as they made their way to the center of the branch. "Excuse me," one of them, a tall woman with a commanding voice, called out. "Who is in charge here?" Richard, sensing an opportunity to impress what he assumed were visiting dignitaries, quickly stepped forward with a broad smile. "That would be me, Richard Blake, branch manager. How can I assist you?" The woman didn't return his smile. Instead, her gaze sharpened as she asked, "Is this your entire staff?" She gestured toward the other employees who had paused their work to observe the unfolding scene. Richard hesitated, his confidence faltering. "Yes, but may I ask what this is about?" "Let's make one thing clear," the woman interrupted, her voice like steel. "We are here to address a very serious complaint that was just brought to our attention. A complaint about how this branch treats its customers." Susan, still at her desk, exchanged a nervous glance with Richard. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the situation. "I assure you, we uphold the highest standards of professionalism here. There must be some misunderstanding." The woman arched an eyebrow, unimpressed. "I doubt that, but let's verify." At that moment, the glass doors opened again, and Harold walked back into the bank, this time flanked by two additional senior executives. The quiet confidence in his step was now unmistakable, and the murmurs among the staff grew louder as they pieced together the implications. Richard's face turned pale as recognition dawned on him. "Mr. Jackson," he stammered, his voice barely audible. Harold stopped in the middle of the lobby, his hands resting lightly in his pockets. His gaze swept the room, pausing briefly on each staff member before landing on Richard and Susan. "Mr. Blake, Miss Carter," he said, his tone measured but sharp. "It seems we need to have a conversation about the way this branch operates." Susan looked as if she wanted to disappear, while Richard's jaw tightened, his usual composure slipping away. Harold turned to the senior executives who had accompanied him. "Please gather the entire staff in the conference room. We're going to address this immediately." The bank's staff exchanged nervous glances as they filed into the room. The gravity of the situation was sinking in, and the light-hearted chuckles that had followed Harold's earlier exit were now replaced with uneasy silence. Harold followed them in, his expression calm but resolute, knowing this was only the beginning of the reckoning. The conference room of the bank was eerily quiet. Rows of employees sat at the long mahogany table, their usual chatter replaced by an uneasy stillness. Harold Jackson, the man they had dismissed earlier, now stood at the head of the room, flanked by two senior executives. His calm but authoritative presence dominated the space. Richard Blake, the branch manager, sat near the middle of the table, his usual bravado replaced by a nervous fidgeting. Susan Carter, seated beside him, avoided eye contact with anyone, her face pale and tense. Both of them knew they were under scrutiny, but neither fully understood the depth of their mistake. Harold took a moment to survey the room before speaking, his voice steady and deliberate. "When I walked into this branch this morning, I came with a simple purpose: to observe the operations and culture of one of our flagship locations. I wanted to see how this team interacts with customers and upholds the values we, as an organization, claim to stand for." He paused, letting his words sink in. "What I saw was deeply disappointing." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, opening his mouth to respond, but Harold raised a hand, silencing him. "No, Mr. Blake, I'm not finished," Harold said, his tone firm but composed. "What I witnessed was a blatant display of arrogance, prejudice, and unprofessionalism. Rather than being greeted with courtesy and respect, I was dismissed, belittled, and ultimately escorted out of my own branch." A collective gasp echoed through the room. While many employees had suspected Harold held some position of authority, the revelation that he was the CEO left them stunned. Richard's face drained of color. "Mr. Jackson, I had no idea." That's exactly the problem, Mr. Blake, Harold interrupted, his voice rising slightly for the first time. You didn't know who I was, but that should never have mattered. Every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. It's not just good customer service, it's a core value of this institution. Susan's hands trembled as she clutched a pen, her earlier smugness replaced by visible regret. Harold's gaze shifted to her, his expression unrelenting. Miss Carter, you were the first point of contact. Rather than assist me or even ask a few clarifying questions, you made assumptions based on my appearance and dismissed me outright. Is that how we train our staff? I didn't mean, Susan stammered, but Harold cut her off with a wave of his hand. I'm not interested in excuses, he said coldly. I'm interested in accountability. The senior executive standing beside Harold, a tall man with a clipboard, stepped forward. For the record, he said, his voice sharp, this branch has received multiple complaints about discriminatory behavior and a lack of professionalism. This incident isn't isolated. It's part of a pattern. Harold nodded, then turned his attention back to the group. This isn't just about Mr. Blake or Miss Carter. It's about the culture of this entire branch. Somewhere along the way, you've lost sight of what this institution is supposed to represent. That ends today. Richard, now visibly sweating, tried one last attempt at redemption. Mr. Jackson, please, I take full responsibility for what happened. Give me a chance to make this right. Harold regarded him for a long moment before replying, You'll have your chance, Mr. Blake, but it won't be here. Effective immediately, you and Miss Carter are suspended pending a full investigation. This branch will undergo a complete audit, and any other instances of misconduct will be addressed with the same level of seriousness. Richard slumped back in his chair, his face a portrait of defeat. Susan looked as though she might cry, but she remained silent. Harold's voice softened slightly as he addressed the rest of the room. To those of you who've been doing your jobs with integrity, I commend you. But know this, moving forward, there will be no room for complacency or discrimination in this organization. We are better than this, and I expect every one of you to rise to that standard. The room remained silent as Harold turned and walked out, his every step echoing with finality. Behind him, the staff sat frozen, grappling with the weight of what had just unfolded. For Richard and Susan, the reckoning had come, and for the rest of the team, the message was clear. Change was no longer optional. It was inevitable. As Harold exited the conference room, the tension he left behind hung heavy in the air. The staff, still seated, exchanged uneasy glances, knowing that the once dominant figures of Richard Blake and Susan Carter had been dethroned in a matter of moments. For the first time, the weight of their own actions, or inactions, pressed down on them. Harold made his way back to the bank lobby, where a small group of executives and onlookers had gathered, their curiosity piqued by the sudden appearance of the corporate team. He stopped in the center of the room, addressing everyone present. Let me be clear, Harold began, his voice firm but not unkind. What happened today was unacceptable, not just because it happened to me, but because it could happen to anyone. This institution was built on principles of respect, equality, and service. If we stray from those values, we betray not only our customers, but ourselves. One of the customers who had witnessed the earlier confrontation stepped forward, a middle-aged woman with a look of admiration in her eyes. Mr. Jackson, she said, her voice steady, I just want to say thank you. People like you give us hope that things can change. Harold offered her a small, appreciative nod. Thank you for saying that. Change isn't easy, but it starts with accountability. Back in the conference room, the suspended Richard and Susan were escorted out by senior executives, their expressions a mix of shame and disbelief. Richard paused briefly near Harold, his once confident tone reduced to a near whisper. I truly regret what happened today. I never intended... Harold cut him off gently but firmly. Intentions don't excuse actions, Mr. Blake. Learn from this, and perhaps you'll find a way to do better in the future. With that, Richard exited, leaving Harold to address the remaining employees one last time. He turned to the gathered staff, his tone now less formal but no less resolute. "This isn't just about punishing wrongdoers," Harold said. "It's about creating a culture where this kind of behavior doesn't happen in the first place." Moving forward, this branch will undergo comprehensive training on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Leadership positions will be reevaluated, and I will personally oversee the process. His words were met with nods from the employees, many of whom now looked determined to rise to the occasion. Harold's presence had not only exposed the flaws in their leadership, but also inspired a renewed sense of purpose. As Harold stepped outside, the crisp air greeted him once more. He took a deep breath, reflecting on the day's events. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from one of the senior executives. "The team is inspired by your leadership. Thank you for setting the standard." Harold smiled faintly, putting the phone away. This wasn't about praise. It was about doing what was right. He walked to his car with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that the ripples of today's actions would spread far beyond this one branch. The bank's reputation would recover, and its culture would improve, not because of policies or audits, but because a lesson had been learned. Respect and dignity are not optional, they are fundamental.